Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for your patience. We are finally able to begin. It's lovely to see all your faces out here. A beautiful full house. Firstly, let's give it up for our guests. So we're here with Keeda Haynes, who will be talking to us about the life-changing journey that she went through and the fantastic work that she has been doing since then. She'll be giving us a reading from her book. But to introduce her as well and talk a little bit about what she knows is Nicole Porter.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. It is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, the author, the special guest of the evening, Keeda Haynes, who will be in conversation with Nicole Hillary, a well-known civil rights activist who's been doing long-standing work on voting rights. And Keeda, the Sentencing Project is so glad to be with you on this journey this evening. Keeda started with us a few months ago, and as you embark on this new journey, Keeda, we want to work with you and journey with you as you go around the country and let the people know about your experience and about the lessons that you learned and the lessons that you have to tell the world. So we are excited to be here tonight. There's so many Sentencing Project staff here tonight. In support of you, and so encouraged and inspired by the experience you'll share with us this evening and the conversation you and Nicole will have on your personal experience and then how that experience is informing the world and the work around voting rights and other efforts to challenge mass incarceration. So the Sentencing Project is a national group headquartered here in DC that's been around for over 30 years. One of our priorities is ending felon disenfranchisement. That means we want to expand the franchise to people inside. Over 5 million people are barred from voting, including the more than 2 million people who are locked up this evening. So Keeda's story is a story of resilience. I'm excited to learn more, to hear more, and to journey with you as we go on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, we do ask that you keep your phones on silent and think of some questions while you're listening for the Q&A afterwards. Mic check, mic check. That's fine.
Okay, I think we're good. All right, so good evening, everyone. First of all, I want to say thank you for each and every single one of you taking time out of your evening to come and to spend time with me and to hear more about my life and my experience and what I've taken from that. I definitely appreciate the support of the Sentencing Project, and they have been super supportive throughout this entire process. And so I just want to thank them for co-sponsoring this event, along with Busboys and Poets. And want to thank our conversation partner, Nicole, here for agreeing to have a wonderful meeting conversation with us this evening. So let's give Nicole a round of applause. And if you guys don't know Nicole, she's somebody that you should know. So make sure you look her up and make sure you donate to her organization. Also, donate to the Sentencing Project while you're at it. But seriously, I do want to thank you. I really do appreciate it. It means so much to see all of you guys here tonight. And so we're going to start out with me reading a portion of the book. I'm not going to read too much because I don't want to spoil it for those who have not read it. And there's so much to this. As I was writing this, I was remembering so much about my life and everything that had happened, because writing this had to travel back in time to really think about a lot of these things. And so this is a part, and this is just kind of will lead you into the rest of the story. So part of the terms of my release was that I stay in school and also to continue to work. Two things I was committed to doing regardless. To make sure I was complying with the court's requirements, I had to check in regularly with the pretrial services officer. Once a month, I called Paul Montgomery, a nice, even-tempered black man who treated me fairly and with respect, a sharp contrast from the government officials I've dealt with so far during this process. He'd ask me how I was doing, how classes and work were, and at the end of each semester, I'd send him a copy of my school transcripts. Considering the circumstances, these check-ins were relatively painless. At worst, they were another annoying set of assurances I had to submit myself to in order to prove what I already knew, that I was a regular, responsible college student who had done nothing wrong. But then came the day when Paul called me to say I would have to do a drug test. His supervisors were going through the paperwork on my case and noticed that I hadn't been tested for drugs since they released me, another common requirement for pretrial release. He knew it was unnecessary, he told me, but those were just the rules. Once again, I made my way down to Nashville's Federal Building and submitted myself to what would be another round of humiliation. With mirrors surrounding the toilet in the bathroom, I peed into a plastic cup while an expressionless white woman leaned against the door and watched, saying nothing. Have you ever experienced a stranger watching you pee like that was her job? It was dehumanizing to be monitored, scrutinized, and judged while you are literally all out there exposed. I know how that scenarios look. These are just part of what the system does to keep you feeling like you are less than. It's another example in a long line of tactics deployed to intimidate, to keep certain people in their places. I had no drug or alcohol history to speak of, but I still had to be subjected to a drug test regardless of what the facts of my life added up to. Sitting on the toilet, watching this woman watching me, I couldn't even imagine what it must be like for people who had to experience this on a regular basis. Having to do it once was more than enough for me. On top of these check-ins with Paul, I was also meeting regularly with Peter to prepare my case. I'm going to do what you want me to do, he told me during our first meeting. If you say you want to take a plea, I'll talk to them and we'll work it out. If you say you want to go to trial, we'll go to trial. I'm not afraid of that. I've been to trial many times before. From the very beginning, I knew that negotiating a plea deal was not going to be an option for me. It went against everything I was to admit guilt when I was innocent. This was essentially what a plea deal came down to. Cop to release some part of the crimes you were being accused of and avoid, or to reduce jail time. I just couldn't do it. Plus, law school was becoming more and more of a reality for me. I knew that there was only a slim chance of me being able to practice law with a felony on my record. And so the path forward was clear. I was going to go to trial. From that day on, the only time Peter and I talked about pleas was whenever the prosecution team came to him with another offer. And there were many in the months leading up to my court date. Every time a plea deal came in, Peter would say, I know we've talked about this and I know where you stand, but it's my obligation as an attorney to share with you. He would convey the offer to me and I would deny it. Then we would keep on moving, preparing for trial. Our biggest task was going through all of the discovery or the state's evidence in the drug conspiracy case, which was a lot since 28 of us in total had been indicted. Up until that point, I had only been afforded small slivers of the picture. What C had admitted to me when I pressed him for answers years before, or what I'd pieced together myself despite his lies. But contained within the mountains of documents spread between Peter and me in his office was the full scope of C and his cousin's deception. Discovery, I realized, was quite a fitting word for everything I was looking at. There was so much that I was learning for the first time. The logistics of how C and his cousins ran the operation, all the things that they kept from me, and how his cousins ran the operations, and from my sister and from Eden, all of the things that they had kept from all of us. The abundance of information and the extent of the whole scheme, it was eye-opening. No wonder they got caught, I thought, scanning document after document. I had already known that C was lying, but now the full scale of it, all of the actors, all of the many moving parts was unfolding in front of my eyes on these pages. The conspiracy had happened, that part was abundantly clear. Peter's focus for the trial was providing all the ways in which I had no knowledge of what was really going on. So we went over everything piece by piece to try to get a sense of what the other side might say and how they would try to lay out how the conspiracy had happened, implicating me. We practiced direct examination and cross-examination with one of Peter's colleagues, Kim Hobby. They would review all of the questions Peter would ask me during the trial. Then Kim would play Sonny Koshi, asking things that they thought he might bring up. Sitting across from me at a long table in one of Peter's conference rooms, Kim acted as obnoxious as she could manage, knowing that this was how Sonny would perform in the courtroom. She hurled her questions at me, adding little snide comments meant to get under my skin. Peter wanted me to be prepared for any of the snarkiness or the rudeness or the disrespect that Sonny Koshi would no doubt come at me with. These days were exhausting. The whole process of the case was, but I was also still had to keep up with my full schedule, both at school and at work. It was a surreal parallel leaving school and going over my own case in preparation for my trial. Professor Woods knew what was going on. The case had started getting some media attention and my name had appeared in a few newspaper articles. We talked about it once or twice, and I remember it coming up one day during a conversation we were having after class. He said that they've got to see you as a 19-year-old girl, Keeda, not the 22-year-old you are now, he told me. Professor Woods knew who I was. He knew that I was smart and on the ball, that I had good grades and things going for me. But he also knew the biggest hurdle when it came to trial was convincing people that I didn't know what was in those packages. People need to see you as you were then and not as who you are now. He suggested that I play down my strength, that I make myself smaller to appear more naive. I listened to what Professor Woods was saying, taking everything in, but I wasn't quite sure that that was the me of the past when I first met C, and the me in the present was so different. I had always been assertive then at 19 and certainly now at 22 and now at 43. In my gut, I knew that when I was sitting up there on the stand, I wouldn't be anybody else. With all of this advice and preparation swirling around me, I inched my way toward the trial date. I was as ready as I was going to be. But even with all the examination and cross-examination running throughs with Peter, all the rehearsing of what the other side might say or do, looking back, I don't think there's any amount of practice that prepares you to face down the system that is trying to take away your liberty, or the people who are accusing you of doing things you absolutely did not do. You can certainly try to prepare someone. You can say, you should answer the question this way, you should do this or do that. Don't let them rile you up. But at the end of the day, it's your liberty, your freedom that's on the line. I was preparing to battle for my life, and so no matter what, I wasn't going to back down.
So Keeda, where to begin? Where to begin? That's powerful language. First of all, thank you so much for allowing me to be in conversation with you. And thank you to the Sentencing Project for inviting me, and to my friend Nicole, my friend Kara. We are all, my husband likes to call us a civil rights mafia. He means that in the best of all ways. But that's what we are. We are justice warriors. We've been fighting together a long time. So I am so honored, Keeda, to have this conversation with you tonight. You know what? Let's start at the beginning. Because I always think it's important for people to know who people are at their core. You know, Keeda, tell us, when you were growing up, and you speak richly in the book about your community, about your family. Tell us what you wanted to be. We all at some point say, this is what I want to be when I grow up. What did you want to be? And did you think any and everything was possible for you?
So I think initially growing up, I think the first thing I can remember is wanting to be an astronaut. Have no idea why, don't know where that came from. I feel like that it came from maybe when I was in school. Do any of you guys remember the Challenger? Yeah. Okay, so I feel like that's where it came from, because I have this vivid memory in my mind, and so I used to always want to be an astronaut. And so then I decided that I wanted to be a heart or brain surgeon. Again, I don't know why. And I don't even know where that one came from, but I changed my mind about that one when I was watching a show and they were actually like performing like some type of surgery on some animal and it was like all this blood and I was just like, I don't think I'm going to do that. And so then I decided that I wanted to be a profiler. I was going to be Jodie Foster from Silence of the Lambs. That is what I was going to do, and I took that seriously. You will see that in the book. I had the encyclopedia of serial killers. I read every single book that I could read about serial killers. I can tell you everything you want to know about Ted Bundy. I can tell you everything that you want to know about Edward Gein, and my mom is shaking her head because she knows those things. I can tell you everything that you wanted to know about a serial killer because I was going to be a profiler and I was going to work with the FBI. And I was going to work with serial killers because in my mind, I felt that if we could figure out why people do what they do, then we could prevent it from happening. And so I stuck with that for a while. That's what I was majoring in. So when I went to college at TSU, I majored. I was majoring in psychology and criminal justice because I was like really going to pursue this. And then I thought, well, I'm probably going to need a PhD, and I don't want to be in school that long. So I switched my degree to criminal justice and psychology, and ended up having to take a legal methods class and had no idea what that was. The book was like literally like this big of nothing but cases. And needless to say, I did not do well initially. But after I got the hang of briefing cases, my professor, Dr. Woods, he told me that I should definitely go to law school and that briefing cases was second nature to me and that I should go to Harvard or Yale because he felt that I could compete with the students that were going there. And so that's where I decided that I wanted to go to law school and I just continued to pursue that. And I don't think there was ever a time that I ever thought that there was nothing that I couldn't do. I just always said like, this is what I'm going to do. And I've always been the type of person that just has proceeded full steam ahead with what it was I decided I was going to do.
I love that, Keeda. And a couple things. I always tell people I can become a doctor, an astronaut, or any of those things. I don't like math. So that's why you go to law school. Yeah. So I tell people, please don't look to me to know numbers. Yeah. Or do anything with numbers. But Keeda, let me say this. I think your early inclinations towards understanding the mind are still applicable here. Yes. Okay, let's be real. Mm-hmm. Understanding why people do what they do is part of how we figure out how to create a better system of justice in this country. Right. So don't lose those skills. Keeda, tell us, so you were then set on the path to becoming an attorney. You knew that's what you wanted to do. From reading about your background, your community, your sisters, your mother, your grandmother, it's clear that you came from a nurturing and loving environment. Let's get right down to the nitty-gritty. Mm-hmm. Tell us about C. Tell us what took you from being this young woman from this wonderful community where you were very grounded and focused, clearly focused, to having what one might call an innocuous set of circumstances lead you into the criminal justice system.
Yeah, so when I met C, I was 19 years old, and we've all been 19, all young, very impressionable. And C was older. C was, I think, maybe 7 years older than I was when I met him. And so when I met him, he said that he was doing an internship here in Nashville. Well, not here in Nashville, in Nashville. And he was in the banking business, and he was completely different from the guys that I was used to seeing growing up in Franklin. Franklin is a small town, 20 minutes south of Nashville. And everybody knows everybody. And so, and I have always been drawn to bigger cities and wanting to get away from all of that. We've all watched Sex and the City. I was going to be, Samantha walking out of my New York brownstone into the crowd because I wanted to get away from that. And so for him, that's what he was. He was different. He was an escape. And he was the first serious boyfriend that I had ever had. because I didn't want to date anybody back at home because you may be dating a distant cousin because that's right, being from a small town where everybody knows everybody. And so he was different, and I was not always, really confident either, within myself. And so I think that he provided those things that I always felt that I was missing in my life. And really really fill the void that now looking back years later can see that I had. And I think that it's how a lot of, young women end up in these situations because we don't recognize that we have this void, and men can come along and for whatever reason fill this void, and then we end up in situations like this or in other situations. And so for me, that's what it was with Z. And then he was this sense of freedom. Like, he lived in Memphis, and so we could drive to Memphis, and we had a sense of freedom. We could go down there and we could hang out without anybody's parents like asking us who this was and who are you related to, who are your people, and so it was just a sense of freedom. And so that's what he represented. He represented all of those things. He was something completely different, and in more ways than one, that's what he was.
And so, when you found yourself as a result of that relationship, Keeda, in the system, what were the first, I would say, 3 things that immediately came to your mind about the circumstances that you found yourself in? What did you first notice about the system? What was the first thing that you feel changed in you about being in that system? And what did motivate you then to want to do it?
So I think one of the first things that changed about me with being in the system is that because I think we all grow up watching these cop shows, right? Watching these law shows, and what it portrays is that people on these shows, that they're guilty, and that people that are guilty go to jail and then they go to prison. And so you hardly ever, and at least back then, now, we're seeing more documentaries with people who have been falsely accused and those types of things. But, there was never really anything at that time that was really portraying that people go to jail and prison for things that they didn't do. And so for me, that was one of the first things that changed because, growing up seeing these things, that's what you think. And as I'm going through this, I'm just like, well, I'm not going to jail, I'm not going to prison because, people that are not guilty don't end up in jail or prison. So that was my thinking going through this thing. And so after I was found guilty, and then I did have to go to prison, so I had to okay, well, here I am going to prison, and I'm not guilty, and so how many other people am I going to meet who are also in this facility that's not guilty? So that was one of the first things that I had to change was my mentality about actually who goes to prison, right? And I think for me, when things really started changing, I remember that I had come back to court, and I was in the county jail, and so we were sitting down in the basement area where they keep everybody before you go upstairs to the courtroom. And I was really one of the only females there, and I remember sitting there in my navy blue issue jumpsuit, and it didn't really dawn on me with what Michelle Alexander talks about in her book. And so every time I think about it, this is the picture that I have, is that I'm sitting here, Black female, on this bench, and literally every single male that's waiting to go to court, that's shackled or handcuffed, they're Black men. Kid you not exaggerating. And so for me, it was just wow, all of these men, every single one of them, and it was at least 10 or 12 of them that were in front of me, they were all Black men. And so, so you really, I know that I'm a Black woman. I know that things that have happened, in my situation. But seeing all of this is just this is not an isolated incident. This is legit. This is an issue here. And so it was just with seeing all of that, and really putting it in perspective, because I'm in a women's facility with women. And so outside of having worked as a correctional officer, with seeing that, but now here I am seeing all of these Black men that are shackled and handcuffed, that are going into the courtroom, that have been, charged with things. And so, it was very striking and very eye-opening at that moment. And then, you start to question, well, what is going on? Because when I was working as a correctional officer, yes, there were Black men, there were, Hispanic men, and I saw this, but at that time, 18, 19 years old, and I'm just doing this just so that I can get credits for school. And so really not having a thought process of like what's actually in front of me, but it was actually like seeing this, and I'm just like, okay, like there something is going on. And so all of the information that I had read about the disparities, with the crack cocaine, and just the war on drugs, it was literally like right in front of me.
You say in the book that the U.S. is built upon a fundamentally corrupt system. Talk to us a little bit more about that. You've already started to talk about some of that, but tell us what else you were experiencing and seeing that makes you think it is a fundamentally corrupt system. And not only tell us what that means to you, Keeda, but if you think that system is fundamentally corrupt and flawed, how do you try to work with it?
Yeah, well, I don't think there's a single person in this room that would disagree that the criminal justice system is fundamentally corrupt. For more reasons than one. But for me, I think it starts, number one, with the over-policing of Black and brown people, right? And in low-income communities. And so when you start to see this over-policing, and then working as a public defender, then I'm seeing like all of my clients are Black and they're coming from low-income communities, right? And so it starts with that over-policing because most of my clients are coming from low-income communities in the Nashville community. And you're seeing this, and, I'm not seeing, like, many white clients at all, very few. And if they are, they're also from low-income communities. And so we start with the over-policing. There's so many reports out there now that talk about how, Black people are stopped, frisked, arrested at a rate that is so much higher than their white counterparts. And so when we start to look at the over-policing of Black and brown and low-income communities, and then how they are brought into the criminal legal system, and then once they're in the criminal legal system, we can start to examine the bail there, and how, people are not afforded bail, or people are given a bail that they can't make. And so most of the time that's the Black and brown and low-income communities as well, too. And so people are then held in custody. People are forced to make decisions, most of the time split-second decisions, about what they're going to do with their lives. So from my experience being a public defender, I had so many clients who had to make a split-second decision, and I say split-second, like literally like within 5 minutes of me meeting them and talking to them about their case, about whether they're going to take a plea and whether they're going to set their case for trial. And so people are thinking, okay, I've got family, I've got a job, I've got all of these things, and so do I gamble and I'm sitting in custody with this bond that's $100,000 that my family can't make? Or if they do try to make it, then they may end up homeless because they're going to have to pull money from rent here with this family member, that family member, that family member. So what we're seeing is that the criminal legal system, it perpetuates a cycle of poverty on top of everything that it does. And so we look at that system. Then we look at, what I talk about in the book, we look at prosecutors. And this is one of the reasons, if you know me, I will say it, and it is a hill that I will sit on and that I will die on, is that there is no such thing as progressive prosecutors. It's all, I'm sorry, and you will never convince me that there's,
I will get some questions, Keeda.
will never convince me that there is such a thing. Progressive and prosecutors do not even belong in the same sentence. And so, there's this whole thing with what I call prosecutorial misconduct. We all know the statistics that, like 95% of cases end up in plea. That people are not going to trial, and it's because, number one, people are locked up in the system, people are given a bail that they can't afford, people are not given a bail in the criminal and in the federal system. Then you have, prosecutors who stack charges. You have what we call the trial penalty, where you are penalized if you choose to go to trial versus if you take a plea, which to me. And so that's right that we all have, the right, to a speedy public trial, that right to, hold the state, to their burden and have them to prove every single element of that offense. Because the system is just an oppressive system, people really don't get to experience the reality of that right. And so, and then, we look at that, and then again, when people are coming out of jails and prisons, the whole re-entry phase. You heard Nicole speak about it earlier, with the number of people that we have disenfranchised because of a felony conviction that's on their record, right? And I mean, this as well as I do with the work that you do, and how that is, has stripped and continue to strip the voting power of the Black communities. And then when we look at that, how where the root of all of that is rooted in, the Black codes and all of these things that came into place, after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction era. And so all of these things, all of these systems, it's a system of oppression, and it's a system that is designed to keep Black and brown people locked out and left behind. And again, and so when we start to look at the criminal legal system, all of these things, there's an intersectionality with all of these things. And that's the reason why I say it is what it is.
I actually said to somebody, as I was reading the book, I said, Keeda's book in some ways is a history lesson for all the reasons you just articulated. Because you can't really understand the system and why it's flawed and what needs to be fixed if you don't understand the underpinnings of it. And going back to that. Sad that we're in an environment right now where people don't want to teach children these things. Okay, y'all. Another book talk. Another day. Call me back, Nicole. We'll have
Yes.
But we all know, and when you refer to Michelle Alexander in her book, we all have experienced lots of learnings and teachings about the impact of race in the criminal justice system and how race shows up in all of these complex ways. Can we talk about gender a little bit? Somebody give me 2 cents. Because there's not enough work and focus done on the experiences of women in this system, and particularly Black and brown women in this system.
Yes.
We have a fellow at Human Rights Watch right now who's working with my program, and her project is specifically focused on women in the carceral system because we don't have enough research there. Talk to us, Keeda, about what your experience has shown you about what we need to be thinking about and talking about when it comes to Black and brown women in particular, and women in general, Black and brown women in particular within the criminal justice system.
Right, and our colleague Ashley just actually submitted a report about that about a month ago about women in the carceral system and the work that I do back in Nashville with Free Hearts. Free Hearts is an organization that is led by women that have been formerly incarcerated, and a lot of the work that we do is women that's incarcerated and the issues. And so it was interesting because being in prison, you see that there are issues that women face that men don't face, right? And so, I didn't have any kids when I was in prison, but there were so many women who did. And so just seeing them still trying to keep that mother-child bond together while in prison was just absolutely impossible. And just all of those things. And then, we hear a lot about women that are incarcerated who are pregnant. And we actually had a bill back in Nashville. You would think it would be common sense where women would not be shackled when they were in labor. And the plantation owners that run the state of Tennessee decided that they were, going to vote against that legislation. And so women in Tennessee that are in custody are still shackled when they have their babies. And particularly in the era of COVID, we've seen a lot of that, a lot of things that's happening to women. Women are assaulted in prison, and no one really even pays any attention to it. They kind of turn a blind eye to it. There are things that are happening to women and their children while the mom is in custody, and if the kids are still out. There's a lot of those types of things that are happening, and women have a different need than men. And so a lot of times what we see is that with women, when they're coming out of custody, just the needs that they have and how it's a different need than what some men have when they come out. And so, I'm glad that you have a fellow that is working at your organization that is doing more work around that, and that our colleague that she has, written an entire report talking about that, and that people are really starting to pay more attention when it comes to the gender differences in the criminal legal system and what those needs are.
Shout out to Ashley for the report. Let's talk about, you mentioned, rights. These are rights. And first of all, what a violation of human right to shackle a woman giving birth in jail. The United States is supposed to be, y'all, the world's greatest democracy. We're supposed to be. So, if we're supposed to be the world's greatest democracy, we're just going to base this part of the conversation on that assumption, Keeda. How do we make that link between fighting to improve the criminal justice system and voting. I still have conversations, you all. It frustrates me. You must have these too, Keeda, with people who do not see the value in voting and how that can change things. Tell us how this fight to restore the right to vote to the formerly incarcerated can make a big difference. Because when we're talking about these numbers, we're talking about power. We all know voting is about power, y'all, right?
Yes.
It's about power and voice. So talk to us about why that fight is so vitally important to increasing the power of a large swath of our community who is often deemed voiceless and often deemed invisible.
Right. So, Nicole can probably give you the numbers in her sleep better than I can when it comes to the number of people that are disenfranchised all across this country. But I think it's like 5 million people that are disenfranchised. And so when we start to look at that, people that can't vote because of a felony conviction on their record, most of those people are Black and brown people. And so it began us when we start to look at the history of felony disenfranchisement, where it came from, the purposes of it, the reason why. A lot of that, again, stems from the fact that they wanted to strip the voting power from the Black communities. And that's exactly what has happened. And so now what we're doing is that we're making them say, you know what, we want our power back. So in one of Martin Luther King's many speeches, he said, in talking about, giving Black people a lot of things, one of the things that he's talking about is that he says, give us the ballot and we'll take this out. And so, and that's what it essentially is, give us back our voting power. And we don't need you, white people telling us what we need and what's good for us. Give us our power back, and then we can make sure that we are electing people in office that is from our community, that believes in the very same things that we believe in, and that's going to get into whatever different office it is, and that's going to really fight for our community and build up our community. And so I think that, as we are moving forward and as we are talking about this, and especially for those groups that do electoral work, I think that it is important that they incorporate felony disenfranchisement into the work that they're doing. Because if we're talking about turning, red states purple and purple states blue, and we start to look at the numbers for felony disenfranchisement, which in my opinion is the ultimate voter suppression, because every single thing that has been codified into law to take away the voting power of the Black communities, we had, you had to be grandfathered in, we had it where there were, literacy tests, all of those types of things. All of those things have been held unconstitutional except for felony and is this somebody that our community is really going to get behind? Because if it's not, then, maybe we need to start looking at the people that we're supporting. And, and that's a whole other conversation with, what we can do when it comes to people that's running for office. And, my good friends over here, Don Dillon, we can have a whole conversation about all of that.
Well, that's why I wanted to get into that, Keeda, because you all will say, you didn't know, I was being tongue in cheek. Keeda did run for U.S. Congress. So, is that something you want to do again? Do you have your sights set on higher things? We can announce it here at Busboys and Poets.
And they would have died back at home. So interestingly enough, when I ran for Congress, I never thought that I would ever be running for office. So I cannot say that I will run again, and I cannot say that I won't run again. Because again, when I ran, I never said that I was going to. Yeah, that's a good politician. Every week I get calls at home about, am I running for district attorney? And I'm just like, where is this coming from? I'm just like, if anybody knows me, they know that I would never, ever do that. Because again, there is no such thing as a progressive prosecutor, including myself, if I was to do that. So, so I have no desire to ever lock people up, any of those types of things. And, we'll see. We'll see. Right now, I love the work that I do. I think it's important work, and I think that, again, we were talking about voting, and I think that, we definitely need to be working to make sure that those that cannot vote because of voting conviction on their right, that they're able to be voted.
You talk in the book a lot about the issues that make it hard for people who are in the criminal justice system. I want to talk a little bit about poverty and economic inequality a little bit. Because I don't think we have enough conversations about the inextricable link between race, poverty, economic inequality, and the lack of power. What should we be doing, Keeda, to really bring out those parts of the conversation, to really make that link more closely? Because isn't that a way, perhaps, to bring more people into the fold? Because when we're talking about poverty and economic inequality, there are people of all shades, sizes, that are dealing with those issues as well. Even for those people who try to put on blinders about race, sometimes even those people, when you want to talk about economics and poverty, maybe they listen a little more. Should we be focusing more on those links?
I think we should definitely be talking about it more. And it was one of the things when I was working as a public defender that I always made sure that I talked about, because of course, working as a public defender, we are representing people who are in poverty, people who cannot afford their own lawyers. And so we were able to see a different side of the criminal legal system versus if it's somebody who could, afford an attorney. So for me, when I went through the system, we were blessed to be able to hire privately. And so when I went to prison and I'm hearing the stories of the women who did have public defenders and all of the things that they said that their public defenders are not doing, and that they didn't do. And so that was one of the reasons why I decided that I wanted to be a public defender, because I said that I wanted to be able to give the same level of representation to people who, who could only afford $5 for it, right? And there is a difference in what happens in the criminal justice system with people who are in poverty, right? And I think that we need to start having more of those conversations. It's one of the reasons why I think that it's important that as we were talking about criminal justice reform, that we do have a space for public defenders to be part of these conversations, because they can bring in that perspective, because those are the people that we are representing. And then also too, that I think that even in that is that, because I would always say as a public defender, I people are not voiceless, it's just that nobody's listening to them. And so we have to create space for those of us that are at the table to bring in people who normally would not have a seat at the table and give them the opportunity to tell their story. Because I can't tell somebody else's story the same way that they can. And then there were things that I learned about, people in poverty in the criminal legal system working as a public defender that I didn't know that I had not experienced. And so that's why I said I can't speak for other people, but what I can do is that when I'm invited to these spaces is that I could make sure that I told my clients stories, and then if the opportunity presented itself, to actually bring in my clients and let them tell their stories.
I think that is so important doing this work. I like to tell people we're vehicles.
Yes.
we're vehicles for people. And that maybe because I have a big mouth, somebody might listen to me, but then I can step aside and let somebody else stand as their authentic self in that space. Keeda, let me ask you one more question, and we're going to open it up to all of you, because I could actually sit here and talk to Keeda for about 2-3 hours. But let me ask you this last thing, and then we'll turn to the audience. How do you maintain hope?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I think it varies from day to day, honestly. But so I know because particularly working as a public defender, like I had to really figure out how do you keep going in this system, because I think working as a public defender, you are in an oppressive system, right? And so it goes back to, one of the questions that you asked about, working in the fundamentally flawed system. You go into this system and you say, I know that this system is flawed, right? And I would use another F word, but it's flawed. And so you say you want to go in and you want to change it, right? And there's not a lot of people that want to do that, because you have some of your colleagues have the privilege of picking this up and putting it down Monday through Friday from 8 to 5. And so when you're a Black person in the system, you don't have that privilege, right? And then also too, your clients, they're looking like, your moms, your sisters, your brothers, your cousins, your uncles, your dads, and stuff like that. And so what I found that, that we dealt with was a lot of secondary trauma as well too. And there would be days, I would go in and I would be like, would just be so over the judges, prosecutors, police officers, everybody. But I had to recognize that, when I started to feel like that it wasn't about me. That I am here and that I am advocating, for someone else. And if I start to internalize it, then I'm making it about me. And so, I really felt like that it was part of my purpose. And so if I'm internalizing it, then I'm taking my eyes off the ball. And so that's how I maintain hope as a public defender. Now, interestingly enough, working, outside of the system, outside of, the court system, I think I'm inspired by the people that I work with, and particularly other directly impacted people in the voting space who want to vote but can't. And so, and it's them and it's their stories, the reason why I'm doing this, the reason why I'm continuing to do the work. And so I'm inspired, just by them and by the hope, that they have, even in, a hopeless situation, even working as a public defender. Like I said, it was so humbling because I learned so much from my clients, and and just seeing the oppressive systems, not just the criminal legal system, but what they're living in, how oppressive that is, and the fact that they are still able to maintain hope in that. And so it's just if they can maintain hope in what they consider a hopeless situation, and a lot of people probably would, then so can I. And so it's just really feeding off of the people that you're around, and and like I said, because one day I may not have hope, but you may. And so you may be able to say something to me that may, re-energize me to keep going on. And so I think that's important that, we surround ourselves with people, like-minded people that are doing this work, and that believe in, the same core principles and values that we believe in.
I love that, Keeda. So, folks, questions. And if you raise your hand, I'll call on you. And could you tell us who you are also before you ask your question? Now, I did go to law school. I do believe in the Socratic method, and I will call on people. Yes.
Good evening, Jermichael McCoy from the city of Richmond, Virginia. Can you talk about how your Tennessee State experience shaped you going to law school?
Yes.
And that sounds like a plug.
Yes, so we both went to the Tennessee State University. And want to make that very clear, not Texas Southern, the Tennessee State University. And so it was really Professor Woods that really helped shape my legal career, at Tennessee State University. Because like I said, when I switched my major from psychology to criminal justice, I had no idea about legal methods or any of that kind of stuff. And Professor Woods was very instrumental with talking me through how to brief cases, and even telling me at one point in time that one of the cases that I briefed was the best brief that he had ever had submitted the entire time that he'd been working at the university, which was a really long time. And it's just encouraging me, to go to law school, and even throughout, my trial, because he knew about that, And I've seen Professor Woods, like, when I was running for Congress, like, he told me, you know, that him and his wife, that they were going to be supporting me. And we, you know, we talked numbers, you know, as far as like the campaign and stuff was concerned. And so, you know, he's continued to be supportive. And so I would say that he definitely had a hand in shaping me at Tennessee State University. And probably a lot of other pre-law students there too.
We all have those people, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
They're so important.
Yes.
Those people who touch us, believe in us, even when sometimes we don't believe in ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
who say, no, keep going and encouraging you.
Yes.
That's vitally important. Are there others? You have family in the audience too, don't you? Yes, yes, okay. Kara.
Kara. Washington, D.C. So I was wondering if, I would look forward to reading the book, but I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about the coming home experience, right? Like, how is it that you, I mean, I understand why you went to law school, but what is that period of coming home and figuring out, what am I going to do now? Like, what was that mental process like for you?
So, interestingly enough, I think those of us that work with people that are, you know, going through the criminal legal system, you know, we know that there's no rehabilitation there, right? So, yes, no rehabilitation. And so I started the rehabilitation process for myself, like when I was there. I studied for the bar when I was in prison. And because I was adamant that I was going to go to law school. And so for me, when I came out, that was what I was going to do. I already knew that I was going to do that. But I had a job already lined up when I came out. Like, I started working with Peter, who was my lawyer, literally like 2 days after I came home as his legal assistant, which is not something that happens often. So that whole reentry process of like, where am I going to get a job? Where am I going to get money from? Like, you know, I didn't have that experience. You know, I had several friends at the halfway house who did have that experience. And, you know, it's one of the reasons why early on, and even now, still really focusing on the reentry piece, because there are so many different collateral consequences that people that have been in custody face upon their release. And I don't think that there's a lot of talk about it. And I think that also, too, that as we are talking about, you know, the reentry process, I think that we have to create space for those of us that are reentering back into our communities to define what success is for us, right? Like, you know, you can say, oh, well, you know, you should get a job, you should, you know, do this and do that. But, you know, that's fine and that's great, but most people who have been directly impacted can only work in certain areas, in certain fields. And so I think that as, you know, the people that are working in reentry, designing the different programs for people in the reentry space, I think that we need to really stop and say, and give people space, time to, you know, space to say, this is what success means to me. Like, there's no cookie cutter method for, you know, a successful reentry. And what I may consider successful may not be what somebody else considers successful. Like, for me, I wanted to come out and I wanted to go to law school. Somebody else may just want to come out and they just want to get a job 9 to 5 and be able to, you know, take care of their kids and provide for their families, and that's success for them. And so we need to give space for that. And so I think that as you know, the organizations working around reentry is that we need to start having those conversations to allow people to define success for themselves.
You know what? I'm glad that Kara brought that question up, because it's one of the things that I wanted to ask you about while folks are thinking about their questions is this. You know, how do we separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of, you know, there's all these policy initiatives underway with respect to how we improve and reform the criminal justice system. But, you know, what kinds of opportunities are available when people return home, when they are making that transition? That's such an important area to focus on. You know, how do you separate out, you know, those reform measures that we really should be focusing on versus those ones that are just window dressing?
Well, I think you probably asked a lot of us, and we probably say that a lot of them are just window dressing because it sounds good, but then it's just about when it comes to actually like applying it, like what does that look like, right? And so I think that as we are creating all of these different policies and procedures around reentry, we need to, I think it's important that we have people that have been through the reentry process, that they are part of these conversations, because it's one thing for people who have never been through that process to come up with policies and procedures, but your policies and procedures in actuality may not work. And so it's good to have that voice of people who have actually experienced that, because there's a saying amongst us in the justice impacted community, those of us that are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And so it's important that we start making sure that people that are directly impacted are at the tables when policies and procedures that are made, about us and about our community. We also say nothing works without us. And so we're not going to support it if we don't feel as if that you have at least communicated with us and with our community. And it's also important to know that when you're doing that is that our community is also not a monologue. Because what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for one, and that there's not one person in the reentry community that also speaks for everyone. And so there are people who may have valuable insights who just have not been called to the table to get that. And so, we need to make space for that. And so, if you're an organization and you want to do that, look beyond the big names of people in the reentry spaces and, go to some of those grassroots communities that are giving, their all, their blood, sweat, and tears into doing this and say, hey, you know what, we want to hear from you. Tell us what you think about this policy. How does this work in practice? And I think that will go a long way, for getting people that have actually gone through, this process to be supportive of what it is that's trying to be done.
I agree. Did I see a hand up over here? Or were you stretching? Okay. But
I can ask a question.
Oh, please, go ahead.
For everybody with Refer Your Vote, and Keeda, I was wondering if you could talk about what it took for you to get admitted to the Tennessee bar.
Yeah. This thing called collateral consequences. And so for me, what we had to do is that, so in order for me to get into law school, I had to actually go to a therapist. And I had to have a therapist write a letter saying that I had the character and fitness to go to law school, right? And, I was fortunate enough that the associate dean at the school, she told me all of this beforehand, and so I was able to do that and was able to get into law school. So get into law school, and I went to law school at night, so it took me 4 years instead of the standard 3 years. And graduated, was able to take the bar. Now, when I submitted my bar application, they do ask if you have been convicted of a misdemeanor or felony, and if so, send us documentation. So, I had to send them documentation. So my application to sit for the bar it's literally a binder that sits like this thick, because I submitted like all of the information. I even asked Peter, because I was working with him, I said, should we send the discovery? And he was just like, Keeda. It's like 5 boxes. And they asked for everything, so I just want to make sure, so I did have to do that, which was not what everybody else had to do. And then with my interview process, the attorney that I interviewed for, he told me that he would recommend that I be allowed to sit for the bar, but didn't think that they would let me because of my background. And, but they did, and so I was able to sit for the bar, and I passed the bar the first time around, and and again, that was a determination, because I was just like, I'm only taking this thing one time. I'm taking this thing again, and I'm never taking another statement ever again. And they need to do away with the bar thing, but that's and so, but the thing was that even after that, I couldn't be sworn in, so I had to have a character and fitness examination. So I actually had to go before the board in Tennessee in order for them to determine, once again, if I had the character and fitness to be able to be a practicing lawyer. So Peter and I joke about it all the time. He became my lawyer again for the last time. And we had to prepare because, I had to go through all of this all over again. And so we had different members from the community in Nashville to also come in to testify. So we get in there, and I think it was maybe like 5 or 7 of them that was, positioned around the table. And so you walk in, and they're all looking at you, nobody's smiling, it's just like, okay, great. And so the man, he was just like, oh, well, we know all of the people out here that's going to testify for you, we know them, we know that they're going to say you're great, whatever, we don't want to hear from them, we want to hear from you. So it wasn't what Peter and I had actually planned. We had planned for them to say all these great things about me, you know, and then just kind of follow it up. So we was like, oh shit, like we gotta figure this out. And so we did, you know, Peter and I worked well together, and, you know, they told me then, it was just like, usually we send people letters, we'll send you a letter, but we're gonna tell you right now, we're gonna give you your license. So that was a good thing. And so I was actually able to be sworn in December of 2012 once I had graduated from law school. So it was actually almost like 6 years to the day from when I had been released.
That's great. I'm going to sign that petition that says do away with the bar exam.
Yes.
Never wanting to do it again, like you.
Yes.
Do we have other questions? Yes, in the back.
I'd like to know, as a young CEO, did you see things that made to help with your transformation, thinking wise, when you went to the prison?
I can't hear you.
I said, as a young CEO, correctional
Okay.
did you see things when you were younger that helped with your transformation, your thinking wise, far as black and brown incarcerated?
So when I was a correctional officer, I will say what I did see was pretty much what you hear about what happens in the jail now. Like, you know, correctional officers just not really caring. Correctional officers just picking with the inmates, starting fights with them, those types of things. And I really did see that, and I did appreciate that. And I was never that type of correctional officer, because I worked in a men's facility, and so I started out working third shift, and I was not a correctional officer that made, you know, my guys go to bed at night. They knew that when Ms. Haynes came in, they could do whatever they wanted to do. And so I worked 11 to 7, and so they knew that, you know, when I came on in my shift, I wasn't going to make them be on their bunk unless I had to go in when it was time to do countdown. They would have to get on their bunk. But other than that, like, I don't care. Like, sit out here and shoot dice with your friends, play cards, I don't care, whatever. Just don't be in here just fighting and where I don't have to come in here and do something, right? So a lot of the guys would like want to come out and talk to me, and they would talk to me about like their stories or situations, like what landed them, you know, to be in the jails to begin with. And so we would talk about that, and you know, and I would just encourage them and talk to them. And even so much so, and it's so interesting because even like when you meet people a lot of times in their worst places, a lot of times somebody is just looking for just a light in that. And so because I respected them and treated them as human beings, because that's what they are, right? I remember I was out in Nashville one day, and anytime I would hear somebody say Ms. Haynes, I know it was somebody from the jail, right? So I was out like with my friend somewhere, and I heard somebody like yelling across this parking lot, and it was like, Ms. Haynes, and I was just like, who from the jail knows me here? And it was one of the guys that had been there locked up when I was a correctional officer, and he came over and, you know, he hugged me and we talked, and, you know, and he thanked me for, you know, talking to him and treated him, you know, as a human being when he was there, you know, in this system, like I said, in one of the darkest moments and darkest places of his life.
Thank you for that.
Mondale Robinson, Black Male Voter Project. Hi, Keeda.
Right?
Talk about PTSD and how you deal with it, and also a lot of the microaggressions that happen when people find out there's a death beside your name. Before the JD.
Yeah. So that's PTSD is real, and you know, there's definitely a mental health component that's not discussed a lot when we're talking about people that have been directly impacted. And I think it's something that we need to bring more into the conversation and definitely into the reentry process, because I think it's important that we remember that, like, I'm not talking about a story. Like, this is me. This is my life, right? Just like it's your life. Whatever you have experienced, whatever you've been through, it's your life. And so it's important to remember that. And we talk about it all the time, like, you know, we're up here, we're sharing a piece of us, you know, with people, and so it's important, you know, that as we are doing this, that people remember that this is not just like, you know, just like some movie that you're watching. This is like a person, this is things that they've experienced in their life, and so it's important to respect that and to give people space in order to, you know, to deal with that. There is no mental health treatment that is available in the reentry process. we talk about this all the time, there are some justice impact organizations who recognize that there is PTSD that is associated with this, and so they have started incorporating that into a lot of their fellowships, right? And so it is real, but then also too, like when you were out, like you said, that you know, the F, like in the Scarlet F on your chest. And so there was a time, like when I was working as a public defender, initially people didn't know. And then there was an article that was written about me, and people knew. And for the most part, people didn't treat me differently, but then certain people did start to treat me differently. Like some of the judges would say certain things, some of the DAs would say certain things. And I even talk about it in the book, is that, you know, number one, being a lawyer in these spaces, you know, it's a white male-dominated space, and so number one, you know, you have to be, you know, Black, you have to be, you know what I'm saying, better than everybody else. You know, Black female, you got to be 2 times as good. A Black female that has, you know, a felony on their record, you got to be 3 times as good, and that's a hell of a burden.
You got to be an astronaut.
Excuse me?
You got to be an astronaut.
Right, exactly. Right, exactly. Right, you know, and so that was the thing, is that, you know, and I don't think that people really realize, you know, the burden that I was carrying, you know, in these spaces with, you know, having to be 3 times as better as my white counterparts. And just, you know, and just dealing with, you know, a lot of the different things, like with hearing, and even still today, like it's so triggering, like hearing people talk about their clients, right, and just the way that they talk about them, and it's just so rude and disrespectful. You know, hearing people use the terminology inmates, like we don't use that. And, you know, and I choose to correct people when I'm in spaces, and this is what they do. Even, you know, those, you know, progressives and politicians that are wanting to, you know, do things that are helpful. But when you're on the stage and you're talking about, you know, you're calling people that are in jail, you're calling them inmates. No, like they're individuals. When you're saying that, you know, well, people, you know, have, you know, they've made some bad choices. Like, let's not use it. You know, so we need to be mindful of the words that we're using. You know, when we're in these spaces, when we're talking about, you know, wanting to be in these spaces, wanting to do work for people that have been, you know, directly impacted. Because I always tell people that it's really hard for the directly impacted community to welcome you in when you're calling them an inmate. You know, like it's hard for me to believe that you have my best interest at heart when you are addressing me and people like me as inmates. And so I think that, you know, and felons, oh, no.
I was getting ready to go there.
No,
yes.
No, that is a big one. Like there's, you know, like, so, you know, so it's important, you know, even those of us in this room, like if ex-felons is something that is in your vocabulary, from here on out, let's not use that. Let's say, you know, individuals that have been, you know, justice impacted, individuals that have been impacted by the criminal legal system. You know, let's not call people by the act that they have been alleged to have committed, right? And so I think that, you know, I think that's important, because if we're really wanting to advance this conversation, first of all, we got to start humanizing people. And so if we're calling people felons, like that's not humanizing people. Again, like we're just referring to people as just a thing, right? And so it's important that we do that. And so even before we can even start talking about, you know, the nuances of criminal legal reform, we have to start with our language. You know, because it all starts with humanizing people. And so I think, you know, that's important. And we went way around your question, but.
I'm so glad you said that. For me, it's like nails on a chalkboard, working on voting rights, when people say felony disfranchisement. No. Yes, yeah, you know, we have these conversations all the time. No. There's a young man in the back who has a question, yes.
I don't know about young, but question is, you kept becoming bitter over the seas of the world. It seems like you got this way to
Who says I did? You know, and in all honesty, like I had to have a conversation with myself. Like when I first got to prison, I said to myself, I could be bitter and I could be angry, but I felt that God allowed this to happen for a reason, and so I can get everything that I need to get from this so that I can move on from this. Or I could be bitter and angry, right? And being bitter and angry leads to so many other things. And I chose that for myself. I chose that I was not going to be bitter and I was not going to be angry because you could be, right? And, you know, not that, you know, that I would ever, you know, like have to see again and, you know, give him a hug and welcome him, you know what I'm saying, with open arms. But it was for me. It wasn't for him. You know, so I made the choice for me not to be bitter and not to be angry, and it absolutely had nothing to do with him because I just didn't want that. I didn't want to be carrying that, you know, for the rest of my life because, you know, we've seen what anger and bitterness can do to people, and I didn't want that for myself.
We can learn a lot from you. Heck, I'll get mad at my neighbor or something. So let me take some lessons from you. Do we have other questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Kedrin. This has been phenomenal. Thank you. I've worked for corporations that have programs for those that have been affected by the criminal justice system, right? Can you speak to any organizations that you think are doing it right? I've always appreciated companies that I've worked for trying, but then I've also felt like they just didn't get it right. Is there any organization that you're aware of that does it right?
So, I mean, I think that there's so many things that can be done, right? And so, you know, there are organizations that focus on just like the job aspect of it. There are organizations that focus on the housing aspect of it. There are organizations that are starting to focus again on the mental health aspect of it. And so, you know, and a lot of these are grassroots organizations, and they're led by people who have been directly impacted because they have experienced these things themselves, and they know what's out there, what's available, or the lack thereof. And so they have created these organizations to fill in that gap, right? And so, yes, the organization that I work at, you know, saying that you work with the Free Hearts, like that is an organization, of course, that gets it right. You know, and you know, just because I love them and everything that they stand for in the community. And there are, you know, several other organizations in the community, grassroots organizations that are doing good work. I'm sure here in DC and, you know, all across the country. But, you know, I would say that 9 times out of 10, it is probably grassroots organizations that are doing it right and not these big, you know, corporations, because most of the time they're just wanting to come in and they've probably taken the ideas with somebody in a grassroots organization anyways.
I'm sorry, that's what I think I was referring to, the larger organizations that are trying to put together these efforts, right?
And I mean, and I would just have to say that for the larger organizations that do want to put together these efforts, like seek out the grassroots organizations in the communities that are doing that work and partner with them. Like, and don't go in and say, oh, well, like, we know how this should be done, we're going to do it. Like, partner with people that are on the ground working and doing this every single day and support them in the work that they're doing, right? Because, you know, you don't have to be the face of all of this. Like, it's okay to be behind the scenes and allowing, you know, again, like, directly impacted people to be the face of this.
Thank you for that work. It's important that people like you are in those spaces. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions before I know you all want to get to speaking with Keeda and getting those books signed. So, yes, here and then I'll go over here.
I work with Keeda project every day. Just talk about all the amazing things you're doing right now.
What am I doing?
The most, but.
So Alex and I, we're colleagues, and you know, Morgan and Kara, Nicole, and I think Marcy had some. And so you know, the Sentencing Project is doing great things. You know, just around the criminal justice reform on the whole, they always have. And so I am really blessed to be working at an organization that I have, you know, admired and used their research, you know, for years and years. And so, you know, we're working on both now. Again, you know, we talked about it earlier, making sure that, and Natalie, she's right here too, and there's Heather, sorry. You know.
The man.
Right, exactly. You know, and so we're working on, you know, voting rights, making sure that, you know, that everybody is part of our democracy. And that is something that's very important to me. Did the work working at Free Hearts, you know, before I started working at the Sentencing Project, and was really able to get into a lot of organizations involved with it and actually people to care about it. When we started to say that there's 420,000 people disenfranchised in the state of Tennessee, people send up and take note. It's just like, whoa, wait a minute, like I didn't know that. And so just to be able to expand that work and to be able to work with, some of our coalition partners all across the country. Democracy Behind Bars. We have somebody here from Massachusetts that that we do work with. We work with the fabulous ladies from CLC, present and past. Around a lot of those issues as well too. We partner with them. They're doing work on the national level around a lot of these things as well too. And so it's just great to be in a position to be able to work with so many people who really care. About a lot of these things and a lot of these issues. And like I said, I feel like I'm in a good space with working on voting issues right now.
And you get the last question.
So, Keeda, Chris Scott, Democracy.
Yay! It's good to meet you. It's
So, what advice would you give to folks? Because I feel like we're starting to see more people actually want to run for office and trying to change the system that have that lived experience. What advice would you give to them based off your own first run?
So what advice would I give people that want to run for office or those that are supporting people? Because those are two different things.
Let's go with both.
Okay, so first of all, so for the supporters, donate. Okay, it costs a lot of money to be able to run for office. And even if it's just, $20, $25 a year, that matters. Like it really goes a long way. And, it's unfortunate that that's the case, right? We're living in this capitalistic society, but that's what it is, right? And so let's call it what it is. But so it's important, that we do that because you do need money. And one of the things that I came across when I was running for office, so we submitted the first report, I think we could raise $15,000. I thought that was great, right? And just we raised $15,000. We're doing something here. And people in the political world is just like, oh girl, you got to fundraise, or you have to do more than that. $15,000 ain't going nowhere, But again, this is somebody that never run for office before, and I thought it was a big deal. So. So it is important, that we donate to people's campaigns because they didn't feel as if I was a viable candidate because I hadn't raised, so much money. And so when they're looking at who is a viable candidate, who can win, they always look at that. And then it is expensive, mailers. Don't even get me started on how much that stuff costs. And TV is expensive. All of that stuff is expensive. Mondale knows, all of that. And so, yes, and, Demarius knows. And so it is important. But it's also important too, and I go back to this for those organizations that, that look for people to run for office, right? And so it's important for, number one, that organizations that are coming into areas and are looking for people to run, that you don't just come into those areas and say, hey, we're here and we know how to do this, and, we're looking for an organizer, that we can put up, how about, you ask people in the community, who they feel would be a good person, and again, and support people from the community, get them to buy in first, because if you don't have community buying in, then it's just not going to work. And so I think that it's important, to remember, because, we know that there are a lot of organizations that are going into communities now, looking for people to run for office, these progressive, organizations, progressive, which is another story, but, and so I do think that is important because you do want community buy-in, right? And so for people that are choosing to run for office, I would say those of us in this room, we can run for office. That's who needs to be running for office. It needs to be people like us, people, everyday average Americans, people, that have been through things and that have overcome things in life. Because, again, like I said earlier, we're tired of voting for, these rich white men who have no idea what those of us are experiencing, on an everyday average basis. And so it's just how are you really able to go here and to advocate for me when you don't even know what I'm dealing with? And so, there are a lot of younger, particularly in Congress, who, what I like to call, they legislate from the community, right? And so I say that because the legislation that they put forward, they are making sure that they're involving people in the community in this process. So when they're thinking about different bills that they're going to introduce, they're talking to community members. when they are drafting their bills, they're sending it to, community organizations and saying, hey, can you look this over and can you, give me your input on this before we actually, file this. And so I do appreciate that. And so I think, for people that are wanting to run, I just say do it. That's what I did. I felt that it was, working in, as a public defender and seeing the intersectionality of all of the issues that are happening in my community and knowing that it's not just a criminal justice issue, that it's a housing issue, that it's an economic issue, that it's a job issue, that it's a healthcare issue. And all of these things were things that my clients were experiencing in conjunction with the criminal legal system, right? And so, for me, it was like, by the time they get to me, there's so many other things that are going wrong in their lives and nobody's talking about. And Jim Cooper couldn't talk about that. I won't get into the details of who he is. Read the book and you'll find out. But he couldn't talk about those things, right? And I couldn't. That was the reason why, I felt that we needed somebody in Congress that could really speak, to these issues. But even if I can't speak to those issues, I know people that can, right? And so that's, to me, that's what's really important. And so that's why I think it's important for those of us that are wanting to run for any type of office. That's important for us to just do it. That's just what I say. Just let's do it. You want to run for office? I'll donate to your campaign.
It has been a privilege and an honor to be in conversation with you tonight. Thank you for all that you are doing and all that you will continue to do. We are all the better for it. And everyone, please buy the book. Yes. Buy the book. Support Keeda. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Okay, thank you so much everyone for coming through. Everyone on our live stream, thank you for tuning in. If you just give us about a minute, we'll be setting up over there. You can have your book signed and sold to you. All right, thank you so much.